So this first lesson in Ezra's 1, 2, and 3 are about a God-stirred spirit because, interestingly, in these first 3 chapters, God stirs people up. And so we're going to make some comments about God stirring people up. If not today, then we'll make them next week. In Ezra and Nehemiah, all told, there's going to be 8 different lessons with hopefully some good practical applications with all of them. One sheet that you got is the chronology, and it's the same chronology that we looked at last time, except on the sheet, because I've just physically got more space, where there are times that we can really date it with pretty good accuracy. I've included that. So when we can get down to the month and the day, that sheet will contain it. It doesn't appear it's just a yearly thing. But you can see that from 538 to 537, we start looking at the returns, and then it goes all the way down just a little over, I think, 100 years to the preaching of Malachi. And if this is correct, if it's close, and even if it isn't correct, it's still got to be pretty close. Which means that on the conservative side, within around 100 years, maybe on the less conservative side, 125 years of Israelite history, there's actually quite a bit going on. Because we've got all 3 returns from captivity. We have the people starting the temple, but then not getting the temple finished. We have the work of Haggai and Zechariah to come and do what with the people? Thinking about the theme of the lesson, what are they going to do? Stir them up. Yeah, they're going to stir them up so that temple is completed. We have more returns of the people from captivity, and then all the way down to the end of Malachi, which closes out the Old Testament history. And Malachi, I told you that historically speaking, with Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, you're only about halfway through physically the Old Testament. And then you get to the wisdom literature and the prophets, and it kind of in time backs up and starts through again. So Malachi would be just beyond the time of Haggai and Zechariah, not by much, but as it closes out the Old Testament period, it doesn't close it out much farther than or much beyond Ezra and Nehemiah, which is really interesting to think about. But sometimes when you have someone and they want to know more about the Bible, it's not as easy sometimes to explain. Okay, Ezra chapter 1. Ezra chapter 1 is just a nice overview because, as you would expect, beginning in chapter 1, verse 1, we have the date in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord did what? Stirred up the spirit of the king of Cyrus, of the king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom and also put it in writing. And we'll get to that. Just as an interesting little side note, with Ezra, when we jump over to the prophets, and I told you that the prophets take Old Testament history and then go backwards and then flow through it, the first year of Cyrus is also right when Daniel chapter what happened? Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5 records the transition from the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire. Because Daniel chapter 5 is the famous what? Handwriting on the wall. And so when I got to the end of verse 1 where it says they put it in writing, that stirred up my spirit to tell you guys that in Daniel chapter 5, that's when this historical event is occurring. So then after that, just very soon after what happened in Daniel 5, now Cyrus is ready to release them. And so they put it in writing saying, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is God, which is in Jerusalem. And whoever is left in any place where he dwells, let the men of his place help him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, besides the freewill offerings for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So this sounds a lot like Cyrus is what? A full-on believer in God. There's lots of great things that Cyrus said that certainly make you think that. The evidence, though, is pretty much just about what you've read, which means that Cyrus, at worst, could just simply have a very great respect for God, or he could have what? Like any politician, he could have what? I've got to send the Jews back. The Jews believe in the God of Israel, so I'm going to pay homage to who? To the God of Israel. You know, at the worst it could be that. At the worst he could be a small believer in the God of Israel. At best, he could actually be a believer, but it's somewhere between those two. Lots of people think it's more along the lines of just having a very small belief in God, or just kind of, it's a really negative word, but just kind of pandering to his audience. Maybe better than that, but Cyrus here sends them back and gives them this statement. Now beginning in verse 5, he's going to reward them. Then the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, and all those spirits whom God had moved, arose to go up and build the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. So the Lord stirred the heart of Cyrus, and now who's he stirred? All of the people of Judah and Benjamin, exactly. And notice this, just really quick, verse 5. We can't notice everything, but Judah and Benjamin. So Judah and Benjamin, there was also one other tribe back hundreds and hundreds of years ago. What was the other tribe that was in the south? What was the tribe that was in the south? Many hundreds of years ago. And then it just kind of disappeared. Simeon. And we often say that the children of Judah had been taken into captivity. But the children of Judah contained the people from Benjamin, and it's just over a much longer period of time, would have included the people in Simeon as well, what was left of them as their own distinct separate group. So in verse 6, and all those who were among them encouraged them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, with precious things, beside all that was willingly offered, that was necessary. If you're going to make the journey, which I've got a map for you to see in just a little bit, that journey was not an easy one. So when you come out of captivity, you know, normally you would think going to a new land, it's wonderful. We get to go back into our land. But when they get back into that land, what is there? Not much. Not much. So they need what? They need everything. They need provisions so that when you go back and settle, there's some way to survive. So now in verse 7, King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and put in the temple of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, brought them out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. This is the number of them: 30 gold platters, 1,000 silver platters, 29 knives, 30 gold basins, 410 silver basins of a similar kind, and 1,000 other articles. And all of the articles of gold and silver were 5,400. All these Sheshbazzar took with the captives who were brought from Babylon to Jerusalem. So he sends them back with, they've got to rebuild the temple. I mean, they can't do that. He can't help them remotely, but what can he send them back with? All of the stuff. Of course, what notable thing is missing? There was no altar. There was no Ark of the Covenant. There was no... What were some of the others? Was no lampstand. Was no table of showbread. Now, it's likely that some of these platters would have been the platters that contained that table of showbread. But when you think about, you look at that number and it's 5,000 art, and you think, wow, that's amazing. But it is kind of interesting what is not mentioned, what is actually missing from them coming back. Whether they reconstructed that or they just continued on with their worship without them is really difficult to tell. But what was interesting is what Cyrus did have, he was willing to give to them so that they could bring them back. This was just good politics. Why is that? Why is that? Yes, because if you now have this land that's under your purview in your empire, and that land is hundreds of miles away, and you have no modern form of transportation, then your options of keeping those people in your kingdom are limited. You either have to do what? What would be the first thing that we would probably physically think of to keep these people in the kingdom of Persia? You would send your what? You'd send your military and you would station them there. The problem is when you've got a worldwide empire, you don't what? You don't have enough people to do that. So another way that you could do it is to build what's called what? Goodwill. And apparently Cyrus was very, very good at building goodwill. Some world rulers like Nebuchadnezzar were not necessarily very good at it, but Cyrus apparently was quite gifted at it. So in trying to build goodwill, in knowing that it's a lot, and you just think about it from a dollars and cents point of view, it's a lot less expensive to have a kingdom when you've got everybody on your side. Money is, we talk about money a lot in our sermons, but let's face it, money is pretty finite, especially back then, because money was only what you could what? We can print money today, which is really convenient, not necessarily the best policy, it's just convenient to make. Back then you had to what? You had to mine it out of the ground. So money is finite. It's a lot less expensive to have people on your side. And this is probably what Cyrus is doing. So we get to chapter 2. And chapter 2, the overview of chapter 2, is recording the first return. And this first return just includes the leaders, and then they're listed by their families, and then they're listed by their towns. That's down to verse 35. Then beginning in verse 36, we have like all of the people who are going to work in the temple, which is kind of interesting and brings up a speculative point, but maybe it's one that's not too off the mark. The point in their return, we've already seen it, is for them to do what? They got to get back and build the temple, which there's a really nice thought in that. We would get back, and if you were looking at it purely from a physical point of view, if you were the ruler and you had to get back, what would you do first? What would you do first? I anticipate our answers are going to be different, because if everyone were different rulers, what would you do first? From a physical point of view, what would you do when you got back? Okay, so you would probably organize a what? You'd probably organize some kind of government with some kind of police protection. Okay? What might someone else do? Okay, someone might start physically rebuilding the ruined cities or building new cities. What else might someone choose to do? Someone may go back and the first thing that they do is start setting up the farming and the cattle and the livestock. What else might someone do? Okay, someone may kind of arrange to have water. What else might someone do? See, there's a lot of different answers, and all the answers are actually good answers. What else might someone do? Okay, Nehemiah gave them protection, kind of like police protection, but back then, the city wall protection. I can at least think of one other thing. Everything costs money, so when you get back, you got to have what? You got to have money coming in. So some people may go back and immediately they set up some kind of very limited trade with the neighboring countries around them. And again, when you go back, you can't take everything. So you've got to not only move in and start producing, but you've got to start being able to buy other things that the people need. So you set up trade. All of these are great answers. They really are. And it just kind of depends on what goes through your mind as to what you would take care of if you were the leader. But what they did was different than all of y'all's answers. What did they do first? They wanted to set up the place of worship. And I think that's actually a really, really nice thought. And what got me on this track is that when you look, if you'll notice up on the screen and up on your and on your pages, the temple workers are mentioned by groups beginning in verse 36, and that actually goes all the way through verse 58. So there's 20 different verses of all of these different people: priests, Levites, singers, and porters, the Nethinim, and the children of Solomon's servants. Then it mentions down about in verse 59 through verse 63, you had people who couldn't be listed because they had no what? Had no trace, they had no genealogy. So altogether, and this is of the three returns by far the largest one. The totals begin in verse 64, and how many were there? 42,000. So remember, there's three returns. So this one is not Ezra. Who is it? It's Zerubbabel. They come back, 42,000. Of course, who's going to come next? No. Who's going to come next? You almost get so wrapped up in the study you forget. Ezra is the one who comes next. And there's far, far, far fewer people with Ezra. Then, of course, Charlie, who comes last, Nehemiah, and there's less than 1,000 people who return with Nehemiah. So this largest group is the largest group by a long, long stretch. There also is the mention in verses 68 and 69 with the gifts that are offered as they returned, and then those who had lived in their cities. And this is how the statement ends, how the chapter ends with this statement, chapter 2, verse 70. So the priests and the Levites, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the Nethinim dwell in their cities, and all of Israel in their cities. So essentially they come in and they get what? To some degree, they get settled. They get settled. And then we go into chapter 3. And chapter 3 begins by discussing here the altar being rebuilt. Verse 1, in the 7th month had come, the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. Then Jeshua the son of Jozadak and the brethren of the priest, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and his brethren, arose and built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, and as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Though, oh, sorry about that. Thank you. Okay. So, though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries, they set the altar on its bases. They offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening burnt offerings. So they go back, what was immediate, the altar, and then them offering up, their sacrifices. Then we get to verse 4. What did they do? They kept Feast of the Tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings in number required by the ordinances each day. Afterwards they offered the regular burnt offering and those for the new moons and for all the appointed feasts of the Lord that were consecrated, and those of everyone who willingly offered a free will offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, although the foundations of the temple of the Lord had yet to be laid. They also gave money to the masons and the carpenters and the food and the drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre to bring cedar logs from Lebanon to the sea to Joppa according to the permission which they had had from Cyrus, king of Persia. And when we get to the next lesson, whenever that is, we're going to start seeing some opposition that builds. But for right now, everything looks pretty what? Everything looks pretty good. It's definitely going in a really good direction. So in verse 8, now in the 2nd month of the 2nd year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, Joshua the son of Jozadak, and the rest of the brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all those who had come out of captivity to Jerusalem, began work and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and above to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. Then Jeshua with his sons and his brothers, Kadmiel and his sons, the sons of Judah, arose as one to oversee those working on the house of God. The sons of Henadad with their sons and their brethren, the Levites. The builders had laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord. The priests stood in their apparel with trumpets. The Levites, the sons of Asaph, cymbals to praise the Lord according to the ordinance of David, the king of Israel. They sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His mercy endures forever toward Israel. That's a common refrain in Psalm 136, among others. All the people shouted with a great shout, and they praised the Lord. Because why? The foundation of the house of the Lord was laid, and everything looks wonderful. But what happens in verse 12? Yes, and they did what? They wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes. What would have made the difference in the two foundations? So first of all, so we started with the tabernacle, and then what did we end up with? Solomon's temple. Who wanted to build it? David. But his son Solomon ended up building it. Okay? So everything's really expensive now. You could build a high school for $5 million. Maybe for 1,000-person student body. That might be possible to do, $5 million. But a $25 million one would be what? Would be a lot better. Because remember, your football stadium's $4 or $5 million of that. And I mean, I'm not kidding. That's just how much they cost now. Solomon basically had an unlimited budget. So it's like whatever their hearts desire to ornately decorate the house of God in reverence to God, to make it a place that was worthy of God, they could spend it and not even bat an eye. On the other hand, you have these people coming back from captivity, and they had no what? They had no money. I mean, not like Solomon. Keep in mind my point here. Not like Solomon. So they had to do what? Yeah, they had to build the economy version. Now, for the people who had never seen it, it was what? It's great. It was great. But for the people who knew what once was, it was what? You know, in a lot of life, this is kind of a side point, not even built into the lesson itself, but a lot of life is just a matter of perspective, isn't it? And this can happen with congregations. In fact, I think I can safely say that it eventually happens to every congregation, especially congregations that get down to 20 or 30 people, and they're within 5 years of closing. The old school members, maybe even some churches could even possibly feasibly have some founding members still alive. They look back, and how are their hearts? They're probably kind of heavy. They're probably kind of sad because it's not what? It's not what it used to be. But there's probably there people who had moved into the area for the first time, and they've got kids, and there's probably not many of them because, you know, the congregation's small. But how do they look at it? It's a blessing. You know, we found this group of saints, and yeah, maybe a lot of them are older, but they've been really, really good to us. They're really, really good to our kids, and it's just a nice, great place to worship. And a lot of life just boils down to your what? It boils down to your perspective. And you can be sad and bitter and angry, or you can be hopeful, and you can be happy, and you can be content and be satisfied. And it's interesting that in such a nice occasion, there was a split group. Some of them were happy, and some of them were wanting to look forward to the future, while the others looked back and just were really, really sad about it. So we will continue on and look actually more at the meat and the specific lessons that we learn from it next time.